I'll let Rain speak for herself.
Sometimes at night when I am sleepy, I feel like I saw a ghost, but I just saw a jacket. And sometimes I thought I saw a ghost in the mirror, but that is just me.
Now, my friend is one of the deadliest people I know. Emotional
Emotional damage.
damage. Hi, I'm Dan from the Christian think tank, and I have a confession to make. I lied. Well, at least for those of you who are watching. My vision is impaired, so I actually need these glasses. I actually hesitated to have them on because for those of you who are watching, you can see that the reflection is apparent. But I need it, and it's true to who I am, so from here on out, it stays, at least until I get better eyesight. Also, if you've watched or listened to the first episode, you may notice an audio difference. Please let me know if you hear me better, and pray that I get a proper microphone next time. And speaking of vision and hearing, for tonight's episode, we'll talk about the senses, and more broadly, perception. Let's think about it. So, what is perception? I mean, I think that we do it every day, but have you ever thought about it enough to wonder on what it really is? Well, there are many possible approaches to answering this question, and many insights that we can discover when we talk about perception. I've even asked a friend of mine, named Rain, to share her thoughts on what perception is, which we'll see later. And there are also answers for this question from a social sciences perspective, but disclaimer, this episode won't talk about perspective from that angle all that much. Instead, this video will focus on physical perception. So, what does it mean to perceive? Let's see here. So, according to Schachter from 2011, to perceive is to organize, identify, and interpret sensations in order to represent and understand what is sensed. And what does it mean to sense? Well, it says here to sense is to detect stimuli and gather information about them. Then, what is stimuli? Well, stimuli, or singular stimulus, stimuli are changes in the physical structure of an organism's environment, whether external or internal. For example, for those of you right now who are watching this video, the astute among you, even if you can see that it's a similar white background, I have actually changed location. Well, life happens, so I have to be here, but I'm glad that I can get to record the rest of the video. Anyway, so yeah, you can see stimuli. There are changes in the environment, but how do we detect them? Let's continue. Detecting stimuli is done by certain things called receptors, and they are in certain organs. These receptors and organs react to stimuli, which then sends electrical signals through the nervous system up to the brain, and then in there, the brain, with all its knowledge, memory, and reasoning, somehow, some way, turns the sensation into an experience. Okay, there's a whole host of questions that you can pose regarding what experience even is and how it's formed, but let's not get lost in wondering about how our brains create experience for now. Let's just focus on perception. Given what we've talked about so far, we now have a simple framework for perception and sensation. We have first the stimulus, then we have the receptors or the organs. And then lastly, we have the signals and the brain. With this simple framework, we are now able to elaborate on the different senses that we as humans have. We have, as it says here, several different senses. based on different stimuli that allow us to perceive and interact with the world around us. And there are corresponding sense organs that facilitate these senses. So, among our sense organs and their senses involved are the following. Number one is the eyes. It says here light from different sources, whether emitted or reflected, reaches our eyes. Receptors of light in our eyes react to them and send signals to the brain's visual cortex, giving us the sense of sight. Number two, ears. So our ears have inner parts, and those inner parts are structures filled with fluids that can move. Now, these motions are caused both by our own bodies as well as by sounds. Sounds are essentially vibrations that travel through a material medium like air or water or even solids. The receptors in our ears react to the fluid motions, allowing us to have a sense of hearing as well as a sense of balance and orientation in space. Didn't know your ears did that, did you? Number three is our mouths. So, the chemical compounds from the food that we eat or from other things that we put in our mouth, like toothpaste, they dissolve in saliva and then they interact with our taste buds that are located on our tongue, throat, and other mouth parts. And they all together give us the sense of taste. Number four, the nose. So there are things called aroma compounds that are found in different things and they come in the form of vapor. They enter our noses through the nostrils, and there are olfactory receptors that are located inside the nose. They detect and chemically react to these aroma compounds, and they affect and give rise to our sense of smell and even help in modifying our sense of taste. And of course, our skin for number five. So our skins contain various receptors for various stimuli, pressure, texture, temperature, and even physical damage. Upon contact with objects and the environment, those receptors activate and they send various signals to our brain, from which the tactile senses of touch, temperature, and pain arise. I have to specify the fact that it's physical and the fact that it's tactile because this does not cover emotional
Emotional
damage
damage.
and emotional pain. But also, our internal organs have sensory receptors corresponding to various physiological states. You got your heart rate, your blood pressure, respiration, hunger, thirst, and many more. So those feelings that you have inside of you when you're looking for food, surely that's a sensation, but surely it's not one of those that we've talked about before. These are your internal senses, and they help us maintain our physical well-being, they help keep us alive, and influence our emotions and thoughts. That sounds familiar. So, can we say your hunger can cause typhoons? Overall, through our sense receptors and the sense organs that they reside in, our senses give us distinct information of the world around us and of the worlds inside of us. Well, that is, inside our bodies. And together with our thoughts, our minds, our brains, they give rise to perception. However, our senses are not always accurate. Our perception is not always accurate, certainly not even exhaustive. Remember our simple framework? We've got stimuli, we've got the receptors and their organs, we've got the signals in the brain. It only takes something wrong in one of them to lead to an error in our sensation, to lead to deception in our perception. Let's explore the examples for each part of our simple framework. So the first one is on the stimulus. Sometimes nature just distorts the stimulus that we receive. It's not really our fault, it's just what happens. And one of my favorite examples of this, and I'm sure you see it every day, is called a refraction. So, what is a refraction? So, refraction is a physical phenomenon where as light travels through different media, it gets bent. And when it eventually reaches the recipient, or in this case, one who is seeing, they see the generated images by the light as different than if the refracting material was not there. This is because the material itself has different properties that causes light to travel in a different way so as to appear bent or at an angle. And we can see an example of this whenever we have a glass of water or a bottle of water like this, for example. If you look through the bottle of water, it doesn't create a good image of me. It doesn't really show me well compared to if the bottle was not there. That's because the properties of the water causes light to travel through it differently than the air around it. And in fact, as a physics major, how we quantify this is called the refractive index. It's a way for us to measure how much light bends or how much light differently travels compared to other media. And for reference, a vacuum, or effectively air, has a refractive index of 1, since it's typically our standard. And from there, other materials have their refractive indices measured. I won't explain the math behind it, but it's a way for us to quantify refraction. And it's a real thing that happens in our world. Another example of refraction is something that we would normally see on a hot day. This is called the mirage. So, what is a mirage? Let's look here again. It says here by Lynch and Livingston that a mirage is a natural phenomenon where distant objects seem displaced because of light rays being refracted. The most common form of mirage that we can see is called a heat shimmer. This happens when a lot of hot air that's near to the ground has a layer of cooler air above it. And because light is traveling both through the hot air and the cold air, it gets distorted enough that when it reaches our eyes, the objects that we see tend to shimmer. You can see this easily on a hot day along a straight road. So you can see that the objects in the background tend to shimmer. Moving on, our sense organs and sense receptors can be impaired in certain ways, thereby leading to errors. Some of them are just for a short while. For example, when you sit on your feet for too long, you cause them to go numb or fall asleep, as they say. This numbness is from the pressure that you are applying on the nerves of your feet and restricting blood flow to your feet as well. Fortunately, being numb from sitting on your feet too long will be remedied in a relatively short amount of time as blood continues to flow when you release your feet from the pressure and electrical signals go back to the nerves that were put under pressure. But some infirmities are longer lasting, some impairments are longer lasting. For a more personal example, you can just see it from those of you who are watching. My eyes. They don't work as they should. I need corrective glasses in order to see better. Without them, I'll need to go closer to the object or squint or wear some other form of corrective eyewear. Now, Before we move on to the last part of our framework regarding errors in the brain signals as well as the brain itself, be warned that from this point of the episode, sensitive topics, particularly those of dire medical conditions and historical tragedies, are discussed. Continue this episode at your own risk. Of course, things can happen in our brains or in the signals that reach our brains that can be in error and can thus cause us to have errors in our perception. For a particular medical example, victims of stroke where blood flow to the brain is restricted, usually because of a blood clot or a complication in the brain causing brain cells to die, they can suffer symptoms of loss of sensation and loss of vision on one side of the body. And more than just physiological conditions, our thoughts can also affect our perception. And if our thoughts are in error, then our perception can be in error. And because we know that it affects our actions thereafter, it can lead to way worse things than what the original error was. A mundane everyday example is shown here by my friend who can sometimes have false thoughts about certain things like ghosts. And so having paranoia for those things, false information about those things, can make you see things differently than what they really are. I'll let Rain speak for herself in the following clip.
What are some examples of you being deceived by your senses? Sometimes at night when I am sleepy, I feel like I saw a ghost, but I just saw a jacket. And sometimes I thought I saw a ghost in the mirror, but that is just me.
Thanks, Rain. Now, that's a mundane example, but there are worse examples out there, especially when you are being misled or ill informed about something. It can also distort and put into error our perception. And what I'm about to tell you may disturb you, so be warned. Erroneous perception can lead to tragedies and atrocities. In fact, they have. Let's look at one historic example. My main reference for this example is by Creston, and it's entitled Paved with Good Intentions, Mao Zedong's Four Pests Disaster. So let's see how erroneous perception can, as the title suggests, lead to disaster. Because sparrows in China at the time were merely seen and merely known to eat lots of grain, lots of seed, and lots of fruit, they were considered among the four pests to be eliminated by China's Four Pests campaign from 1958 to 1962. As sparrows were killed or driven from their nests, locust populations rose because they lost a natural predator. With the rise of locust populations, it swarmed the Chinese mainland, and this ironically became a significant part of the Great Chinese Famine. It is one of the deadliest man made disasters in history, where millions of people perished and millions more suffered, all because of an erroneous perception that sparrows only ate seed and fruit and grain, and not the insects that would also eventually cause their famine. And that was quite the episode. We discussed about perception, what it is, the framework that we can understand perception in, the different senses that we have, and the errors and consequences that can come from it. So thank you for listening, and I hope that this has been eye-opening for you. As you continue thinking about it, that is your perception and I guess your sensations, I invite you to be mindful of your senses, of your perception, and their limitations, their shortcomings, that we may avoid erroneous perception and the bad consequences that often happen because of them. So keep thinking about it, be mindful of your perception in both sense and thought, and as always, keep thinking.